So welcome to, I think this is lecture 41 or 42, somewhere around there. And we're about to study chapter 59 of part 1 of Rambam's Mor Nevuchim Guide for the Perplexed. And the Rambam has just introduced us to his idea that anything any positive affirmation, any positive description of God is really just is wrong because we can't, number one, we can't understand God's essence at all. So any description we try to use is by definition explaining him in human terms. And number two, what it really ends up being is it's not really an attribute, it really ends up being a fault, because if you say that he's bigger than me, well maybe there's something that's bigger than him. If you say that he's very kind, well, that means that, or maybe he's the kindest. Well, maybe one day we'll find someone who's kinder. So basically what you think is a compliment is really a fault. So the key being, so he described to us his idea of describing God through negative attributes, through negations, by saying the way we can come, the closer and closer we can come to understanding God is by saying that he's not. His knowledge is not something that humans comprehend. It's not like a human knowledge, but just more knowledgeable. It's not like a human strength, but more strong. It's not like human compassion, but more compassionate. It's something completely different. And it is his essence, his simple essence. Now, once he said this, so he said, so no matter what you do, no matter how much you describe God in that way, you're never actually describing God's essence, which is the point. Because we can't. That's why it's an acceptable form of understanding God. That's why it's an acceptable form of trying to get closer and closer to understanding him. So now he deals with the question, and I read this to you guys, I can't remember when, way back. I can't even remember what context, but I quoted a little bit of this chapter earlier, but now we're doing it in order, and now we're up to it. So I'm on chapter 59, page 137 in the Pines edition. So someone may ask and say, if there is no device leading to the apprehension of the true reality of his essence, right? And if demonstration proves that it can only be apprehended that he exists and that it is impossible to ascribe to him affirmative attributes, in what respect can there be superiority or inferiority between those who apprehend him? In other words, if I tell you that it's true, that one cannot describe God's essence, and God is something we cannot completely, it's impossible for a human being to comprehend, then what does it mean when one says that a certain individual has achieved a great heights in understanding of God as opposed to someone else who hasn't achieved that height? What does it mean that, oh, he's a person that knows God? Oh, he's not such a knower of God. How does that work? So, however, if there is none, Moses, our messenger, Moshe Rabbeinu and Solomon, who were known to be two people that had tremendous amount of knowledge, they didn't apprehend anything different from what a single individual among the pupils than just some random student apprehends. There can be no increase in this knowledge. If it's something that we can't comprehend, what do we mean when we say that Solomon, that Shlomo HaMelech had so much knowledge and Moshe had so much knowledge, if this is not something we can have knowledge of? So Rambam goes and continues. I just turned the page, I'm on 138, in a long paragraph here. It is generally accepted by men of the law, that people that study Torah, right, or even the philosophers, not just the religious philosophers, that there exist numerous differences of degree in this respect. Even though I just asked the question, how could it be? We do understand that it is true. There are differences. Some people really know, and some people know a little less. So therefore, I think next time I'm going to use a different laptop, because this problem might be my camera. This fuzziness. I'm sorry about that. But it should go away in a few seconds. So know therefore that this is indeed so, and that the differences of degree between those who apprehend are very great indeed. Despite my question, I'm telling you off the bat that there are differences in degree. So how does that work? If you take something of which attributes are predicated, in other words, take any physical thing that we're aware of which we can describe positively, right? It becomes more particularized with every increase in attributes that are predicated of it, right? The more you can describe it, the more you know about it. So, if you have a table, you first say it's a certain size, It has a certain amount of legs. It's made out of a certain material. It's a certain color. It has a certain amount of strength, and so and a certain shape, so on and so forth. Every attribute that you attribute to that table, the more you describe, the more you know the nature of the table, and the more you understand it, right? He who predicates these attributes accordingly comes nearer to the apprehension of true reality of the thing in question. In a similar way, you come nearer to the apprehension of him, and the same thing happens, although slightly differently, as he's going to describe, when we're discussing God. With every increase in the negations regarding him, and now listen carefully, because this is going to go from a philosophical idea that sounds a little dry to something that's astoundingly powerful and beautiful, right? The more you know what God is not, you come nearer to the apprehension of God than someone who does not know what he's not, right? Who does not negate with regard to him that which, according to what has been demonstrated to you, must be negated. For this reason, a person could, when studying a science, let's say, he sometimes labors for many years in order to understand some science and to gain true knowledge of its premises so that he could have certainty with regard to the science. You study for years and years, you learn all the basic principles of whatever science it is, and then you get more and more advanced and you do more experiments, and more you get closer to understanding that which you're trying to attain. Whereas the only conclusion from this science, but this science in particular, when we're talking about this, the knowledge of God in its entirety, consists in our negating with reference to God some notion of which it has been learned by means of a demonstration that it cannot possibly be ascribed to God. So in other words, the more we study about the world, and he's going to say this more clear, the more we learn about our surroundings. And this is where Rambam's idea of learning and understanding, remember when he talked about the great knowledge that Moses had, his knowledge was the knowledge of the world around him, right? When it describes the wisdom of Solomon, the verses say Solomon was wise because he learned about the trees and the birds, and he learned about how to build, and how it was a knowledge about the world around him. The more we learn, the more positive knowledge we have, and then we say that God is something else. God is something beyond that. God is something greater than that I can't even describe in the things that I can describe the worldly things with, right? That's how we get more knowledge of God. It's an incredibly powerful idea, this idea that the way we learn about God is we learn about what he's not. And the way we learn about what he's not is we learn about the world that surrounds us. It's a really beautiful idea. To someone else who falls short in the knowledge of speculation, this demonstration will not be clear. And if you don't learn, you don't study the knowledge that is attainable by human beings, you'll never be able to fully comprehend and appreciate the greatness of God. And he will consider it again doubtful whether or not this notion exists with reference to God. In other words, someone who falls short might think, maybe God's just really strong and really big. Maybe I can say that he's strong. Maybe I can say that he's really large. Maybe I can't. But as those of us that are studying together know that that's not something that we can say. And if we ever use those terms, we have to understand what we're really saying and what we're really not saying. Again, another one belonging to those who are struck with intellectual blindness. So if you have one person who is completely intellectually blind, he ascribes to him the notion, which has been demonstrated, should rather be negated with reference to him. Someone will get up and say, God is the wisest of all, right? And you and I both know that the wisest person knows that that's attributing the language of wise, which describes a human attribute, to God is wrong, right? Because God's wisdom, so to speak, is something that we can't understand, we can't attain, we can't describe, and it's not of the same nature as our wisdom. So saying that he's wise in a human way is, if anything, an insult. For instance, I shall demonstrate that he is not a body, whereas another man will doubt and say, well, I'm not sure, is God a body or not? And then a third man, right, will categorically decide that he is a body, and he'll just try to seek God in that way by means of this belief. He imagines God as this very compassionate, wonderful old man who whatever. That person is, and he has this spiritual experience that he thinks is spiritual, approaching God in that way with that image, right? But it's a fraud, right? It's not true. Now, many of you are aware that in many streams of Judaism, we use images like this. Even Rambam would be very much against that, right? And he's saying that right now. A person that tries to seek God by describing him in a human way is making a big mistake. How great is the difference between the three individuals? The first, who knows that God is not a body, is undoubtedly nearer to God. The second is far from him. The one who's not sure, he's far away from him, right? And the third, who thinks that God really is a body, is even farther away. Similarly, if we may suppose a fourth person, to whom the impossibility of affections in him may be exalted, has become clear by demonstration, a person that has thought about these ideas and read this book that I'm writing and realizes and understands that logically it's impossible to even describe God with any affirmations, with any affectations, right? Whereas this was not the case with regard to the first one, who denied his corporeality. I have someone who just said, okay, he's not a body, but I can still describe him. The guy who realizes that I can't describe him at all, he's the highest, he's the closest, he has the most knowledge. This fourth individual will undoubtedly be nearer to God than the first, and so on always. If an individual exists to whom it has been made clear by demonstration that many things whose existence with reference to him or proceeding from him we hold possible, that other people think, well, maybe I can attribute that to God. But he knows, on the contrary, that it's impossible with reference to him, and so on. And this applies, in other words, and it goes on and on and on. That individual will undoubtedly be more perfect than we. Okay, so the person that realizes that we can't attribute any attributes, anything, so the more he studies what we can't describe God, the more understanding he gets of God himself. Now, it has accordingly become manifest to you that in every case in which the demonstration that a certain thing should be negated with reference to him becomes clear, you become more perfect. The more you study, the more you learn, the more you know, and the more you realize how little we know of God and how little we're able to describe and explain him, right? You become more and more perfect. And every case which you affirm of him additional thing, but the opposite is also true. Every time you describe him in a certain way, you become one who likens him to other things. You're comparing him to worldly things, then you're getting further and further from the knowledge of the true reality. So here he's answering the question with which he started this chapter, right? It is from this point of view that one ought to come nearer to an apprehension of him by means of investigation and research. That's how you study and learn and study and learn. And as you study and learn, but especially things that aren't necessarily about God, what you're also doing is you're learning about God. And just try to think about how strong that idea is. All of our learning, all of our study, everything we learn about the world around us and about people and about the nature and about the stars and the moon and the planets, and whatever we learn, we're bringing ourselves closer to God. It's an incredibly powerful idea here. Namely, in order that one should know that the impossibility of everything that is impossible with reference to him, the more we learn, the more we know, the more we realize how great God is, because he's not the things that we can see and measure and describe. Not in order that one should make an affirmation ascribing to him a thing as being a notion or so on, like, not by describing him a certain way, because one might find that I'm kind of paraphrasing here. I'm on page 139. One might find that some sort of a perfection with reference to us, like if you described me and said, oh, he's really smart. He's he's a great guy. He's really nice. He's whatever thing. So to me, that feels great. That's wonderful. You give me a pat on the back. I feel real proud. I smile and it's wonderful, right? But if you use that to God, right, for all perfections are habitus, right? When you say that perfection describes a thing, right, and not every habitus can exist in every being possessing habitus. No, that when you make such an affirmation ascribing another thing to him, what you're doing is you're getting farther away from him. One of them, that everything you affirm is a perfection only with reference to us, right? Everything you say that you think is a compliment is only really a compliment to human beings. And the other is that he does not possess a thing other than his essence. God is just God, right? God isn't have this quality and that quality. There's not divided up. All of that, everything is one thing, and that one thing is God himself, which we have made clear is identical with his perfections. Now, I'm on the third paragraph on page 139 now. As everyone is aware that it is not possible except through negation to achieve an apprehension of that which is in our power to apprehend, and then on the other hand, negation does not give knowledge in any respect of the true reality of the thing with regard to which the particular matter in question has been negated. So, in other words, he's reiterating what he said in just a quick sentence. He said that now that we got it clear, right, Yet the only way we can understand and describe God is through describing negation. And that when we do describe God through negation, we're not actually describing his essence itself. So all men, those of the past and those of the future, affirm clearly that God cannot be apprehended by the intellects. God is not something that we can understand, and that none but he himself can apprehend what he is. And that apprehension of him consists in the inability to attain the ultimate term in apprehending him. Once you get to the point where you truly cannot describe him, that's when you've reached the ultimate truth. Thus, all the philosophers say we are dazzled by his beauty and he is hidden from us because of the intensity with which he becomes manifest, just as the sun is hidden to eyes that are too weak to apprehend it. This has been expatiated upon in words that it would serve no useful purpose to repeat here. In other words, I said this, I made it clear, I don't need to go on. Then he brings an interesting verse from Psalms, from Tehillim, chapter 65. And here's where Rambam always brings support from both the Chazal and from the Navi, from the prophet. So here he brings from Psalms. It says in Hebrew, Lecha dumia tehila Elohim b'tzion. So there's a lot of different translations, but the way Maimonides translates this verse is dumia means silence here, from the language of dom, from silence. So like from Vayidom Aaron, Aaron was silent after the death of his sons. So then the words, it translated that way, it would mean, because it could also mean from domet, to compare, but that's not how Rambam's translating it. L'cha dumia tehila, to you, silence is praise, O God who dwells in Zion. So therefore, he says, the most apt phrase concerning this is the dictum occurring in Psalm, silence is praise to thee, which when we look at what it really means, it's teaching us that with regard to you, God, the best way to praise you is to be quiet and recognize that I can't describe you. Now, this is going to go directly into Rambam's idea of what prayer is supposed to be, which is really silence. And we're going to see that as he develops this idea. Be silent and be in awe of how much we don't and can't comprehend God, and how much he is beyond us and beyond our capabilities to comprehend and describe. This is a most perfectly put phrase regarding this matter, this verse that I just quoted. For whatever we say intending to magnify and exalt, no matter what we say with the intent to make God great and so on the one hand, we find that it can have some application to him, may be exalted. On the other, we perceive in it some deficiency. Every time we describe God in a human way, in the end, it ends up being deficient, right? Accordingly, silence and limiting oneself to the apprehensions of the intellect are more appropriate. It's better to limit yourself to what we really can understand, just as the perfect ones have enjoined when they said. And then he brings another verse from Psalms, and this is in chapter 5. Let me get it. There it is. This is chapter 4, verse 5. Rigzu v'al techato, tremble and do not sin. Imru v'levavchem, speak in your hearts. Al mishkavchem, when one lies on one's bed. V'domu sela, and be silent. So the Rambam says what this means is that when contemplating, silence is what God wants. Silence and true contemplation is what is important. Now, once he turns to, now that he's described God that way, and he brought his proof from the verses from Tanakh, he's going to bring a very famous story from the Talmud, which I'm going to read to you. This comes from Masechet Brachot 33b, and it's a famous story, but it's worthwhile reading it, and now reading it with Rambam's ideas in the background. So the Rambam quotes it in 140. I'm on page 140 of the second chapter. I'm gonna read it to you from the Talmud here. There was a guy who went down to the to lead the prayers at Rabbi Hanina's synagogue, right? So Rabbi Hanina was the rabbi, and this guy went up to lead the prayers. So instead of saying the standard prayers, this guy gets up there thinking that he's going to be like super duper pious. He's really going to praise God. So we all know, we start off the reading of the Shemona Esrei. We start off with Hakel Hagadol Hagibar V'Hanora, God the great, the powerful, and the awesome. And why we use those terms we're going to discuss in a minute. But this guy went going. Via Adir, via Izuz, via Yoroi, via Chazak, via Ametz, via Vadai, via Nichbad. He's mighty, awe-inspiring, strong, fearless, steadfast, on and on and on and on. Himtin lo adesayim. So Rabbi Chanina waited till this guy finished his long speech, exalting the greatness of God. Kisiyam Amarle. So when he finished this long speech with all these attributes, he said, have you finished describing your master God? Are you done? In other words, is that it? You don't have any more? You're over? What did you need to go on off and off like all that? Anan hanit laste amrinan. Even the three that we say, right? The three gadol, the three with which we lead off the prayers with, if not for the fact that Moshe, our teacher, that Moses said these in the Torah when he described God himself. And if not for the fact that the leaders, the men of the great assembly, the final prophets in our history, placed this in our prayers, we wouldn't even be allowed to say even those, because we shouldn't be praising God at all with human words. And you keep on going on and on and on and adding all these things. We really technically shouldn't even be allowed to say the first three, but we do anyway, because Moshe and Anshe Knesset Gdola said it's okay. So then it continues. It says, Mashal, this is comparable to Melech Basar V'Dam, to a king of flesh and blood, an ordinary king. Shoayelo Elef Alafim, he had 100,000 golden dinars in his treasury. Wealthy king full of gold. And they come and someone comes and says, oh, king, you're so wealthy, you have so much silver, right? That's an insult. This guy's proud of all his gold and you're complimenting his silver, right? So that's the story. So Rambam, now that I'm going to skip to the middle of 73 on page 140. Consider, in the first place, his reluctance and unwillingness to multiply the affirmative attributes. Number one, Rabbi Chanina did not want to allow this person, did not want to discourage him from going on and on with attributes. Consider also, it has stated clearly, that if we have left only to our own intellects, in other words, logic would have led us to believe that we should never have mentioned these attributes or stated a thing appertaining to them, that we should never have said any, right? However, why were these three allowed? Here's the Rambam talking. Why were we allowed to say anything in our prayers that praises God? Because the necessity to address men in such terms as would make them achieve some representation, obliged resort to predicating of God their own perfections when speaking to them, because people are simple-minded and we need to describe God as something great. So we're allowed to use these terms that were given to us in the Torah to describe God, even though we know that they're not real, right? It must then be our purpose to draw a line. Therefore, we have to say that what are we allowed to use? Only those things that we're permitted to use. Only using these expressions and not apply them to him, except only in reading the Torah. When we're reading the Torah and it uses terms that the prophets themselves used, or Moshe used himself in the Torah, we can say that. But when we're writing our own prayers, we shouldn't be saying these things. Rambam was stepping on a lot of people's toes here, because we recognize that this is not necessarily the practice that we have. There's a lot of songs that we sing that praise God, and there's a good argument to be placed against Rambam. But remember, we're learning Rambam now, so we have to take his point of view. Okay. So, however, as the men of the great synagogue, or also known as the men of the great assembly, who were prophets themselves, right, appeared in their turn and inserted the mention of these attributes in the prayer, they took them out of the verses. And they said we can use these in the prayers. It is our purpose to pronounce only these attributes when saying our prayers. These we were given permission to use for the reasons which I stated, right? According to this spirit, this dictum makes it clear that as it happened, two necessary obligations determine our naming these attributes. There's two things. Number one, they occur in the Torah, and the other is that the prophets decided to place them into prayers, right? And those are the only things. Accordingly, we should not have mentioned these attributes at all, but for the first necessary obligation and but for the second necessity. In other words, you have to have those two characteristics. If not for that, we should not have taken them out of their context. We shouldn't have taken them out of the verses and should not have had recourse to them in our prayers. As you continue to consider the attributes, it will become clear to you from the statement that we are not permitted in our prayers to use and cite all the attributes described to God in the books of the prophets, even the things that are in verses, unless they were placed in the prayers by the men of the Great Assembly, who are the ones that wrote the prayers that we say today in synagogue. For Rabbi Chanina not only says, if Moshe, our teacher, had not said them, he also said, and if the men of the Great Assembly had not placed them in our prayer book. Now he's going to get really tough, okay? So some of you asked about the Anim Zemirot, right, which we sing on Shabbat morning after the prayers, which graphically describes God in all kinds of beautiful ways. Rambam wouldn't have used the word beautiful because he doesn't like that at all, which he's about to attack. Many of the poems that are said in many of our prayers. So here goes. And this is one of the things that turned off some of his detractors. Thus, what we do is not like what is done by the truly ignorant, who spoke at great length and spent great efforts on prayers that they composed and on sermons that they compiled and through which they, in their opinion, came nearer to God. In these prayers and sermons, they predicate of God qualificative attributions that, if predicated of a human individual, would designate a deficiency in him. For they do not understand those sublime notions that are too strange for the intellects of the vulgar, and accordingly took God, may he be magnified and glorified, for an object of study for their tongues. They thought that God, we can describe him in our poems, in our songs, we can describe him, we can praise him, and thereby, and by singing these things, saying these things, writing these things, speaking these things, we could somehow get closer to God that way. They predicated attributes of him and addressed him in all the terms that they thought permitted, and expatiated at such length in this way that in their thoughts they made him move on account of an affection. They thought that God has so much compassion so we can appeal to him and change the way he controls this world, and change, which Rambam says that's not how it works, right? They did this especially when they found the text of a prophet's speech regarding these terms. They took the prophet's words and used them this way. Thereupon they had full license to bring forward texts that ought to be interpreted in every respect and to take them according to their external meaning. They forgot to look past the external meaning of the words, which and looked at their surface meaning, to derive from them inferences and secondary conclusions, and to found upon them various kinds of discourses. This kind of license is frequently taken by poets and preachers, or such as think that what they speak is poetry, so that the utterances of some of them constitute an absolute denial of faith, while other utterances contain such rubbish and such perverse imaginings as to make men laugh when they hear them. Some of them describe God in such ways that a person would step back and look. Well, God, Anonymous Miro would be a great example, describing God having hair that's flowing, and it's like, what? A person, someone's going to laugh. God has hair. Like, what kind of craziness is that, right? Tal talim shechorot is the term that Anonymous Miro uses. You'll remember, it kind of rolls off our tongue and it bears when we sing it. But if you thought about it, like, what? God has curly black hair. Like, well, what's that supposed to mean, right? If I were not unwilling to set out the deficiencies of those who make these utterances, Rambam did not point. He's saying, if I were not unwilling, meaning I am unwilling to point out who I'm exactly directing this against, right? He had in mind some people that write this stuff, right? I should have quoted to you something of the latter. I should have quoted you some of these examples of the stuff that made it into our prayers, in order that you should give heed to the points in which they may be impugned, so that you can look at it and show and know yourself what the problems are with some of these prayers. However, the deficiencies in these utterances are most manifest to him who understands. If you understand what I'm saying and you get what I'm telling, you can figure it out on your own, which ones of these prayers are problematic. I don't need to point it out to you. I'm not here to pick fights. It also behooves you to consider and say that, in view of the fact that speaking ill and defamation are acts of great disobedience, in other words, we shouldn't say lashon hara, we shouldn't say bad things about others, right? How much all the more so is the loosening of the tongue with regard to God. If that's a sin when you're talking about a human being, imagine the sin when you talk about God in a way that minimizes him and that takes away his true greatness. And all the predicating of him qualificative attributions above which he is exalted, right? And by calling God something that's a human attribute, what you're really doing is taking him down And that's because he's way beyond that. So that is, of course, even a bigger sin. But I shall not say that this is an act of disobedience, but rather, usually, here he's saying like a little bit in favor of those that write these things. Usually, these people are not disobedient to God. Usually, it is simply unintended. I don't know what these words mean. Ablakui, I don't know what that means. I'm on top of page 142. If someone knows English well enough to know what that means, let me know. And vituperation on the part of the multitude who listen to these utterances. Usually, it's not intended to insult God. It's just that these people are just don't know better. They think that what they're doing is beautiful and wonderful and spiritual, and on the part of the ignoramus who pronounces them. As for him who apprehends the deficiency, but if there's someone who realizes what's wrong with this and yet uses those speeches, but he still goes ahead and does it, then he belongs, in my opinion, to the category of people of whom it is said, and the children of Israel did impute things that were not right unto the Lord their God, and so on. He has several other quotes that aren't very complimentary. You ought not listen in any way to these utterances, let alone give expression to them, and still less make up others like them. For you know the extent of the sin of him who is a metiach dvarim klape mala, who makes vituperative utterances against what is above. In other words, say insulting things about God is a great sin. You accordingly ought not to set forth in any respect the attributes of God in an affirmative way, with a view, as you think, to magnifying him, which is ultimately not, and ought not to go beyond that which has been inserted in the prayers and the benedictions by the men of the great synagogue. So you say the prayers that are there, that were written, and don't go off on your own, making up what he's specifically referring to is not all prayers, but prayers that exalt God in various terms. In fact, as Rabbi Hanina said, it is sufficient from the point of view of necessity to say just what's there, as Rabbi Hanina said. But regarding the other attributes that occur and so on, I'm kind of running through this a little bit. Those and when you do study in the words of the prophets, remember what I described to you already, and we've studied this together. When the prophets describe God in that way, they're not. You have to look past the surface meaning and understand that what it's describing is not God himself. It's describing the action that is attributed to God that we experience. So when we say that God is powerful, we don't mean that he is powerful. What we mean is that God has interacted with the world in such a way that we experienced a powerful act. So that if you see an earthquake and you say how powerful God is, it's okay to say that as long as you understand that you're not actually calling God powerful. What you're actually doing is saying, I just saw something that I experienced as an extremely powerful thing, and God is responsible for it, right? So remember that concept. I mean, we spoke about that at length earlier, but Rambam is assuming that we know this already, right? This notion concerning them should also not be divulged to the vulgar. But this whole idea that I'm telling you, if you tell someone who's not intelligent enough and won't get it, don't even bother explaining it to them. For this kind of speculation is more suitable for the elite. In other words, Rambam realizes what he says is true, but if you tell this to people that are too simple-minded, that haven't been through the process, they won't get it. They won't understand it. So it's better to let them think that they're praising God. This is a pretty strong statement. But if you really think with the truth, like the elite who consider that the magnification of God did not consist in their saying improper things, but in their understanding properly. The way we get to know God is not by just saying things that sound great and exalted, but rather it is by truly thinking and understanding and intellectually comprehending what we're saying. And now I'm going to read through to the end of the chapter. I know I went through a lot without stopping for a break for questions, but there's one more paragraph which will wrap up this whole idea. Then I'll give a really quick summary and then we'll open the floor for questions. Hereupon I shall return to the end. What is the end of the story of Rabbi Hanina? That story ended where he says it's like praising a king that has gold and praising him for silver. Now, why did it say praising a king that has 100,000 gold dinars in his vault? And you tell him, oh, you're so great because you have 50,000 gold dinars in his vault, right? That would also be an insult. But that's a quantitative insult, not a qualitative one, right? Meaning you're saying you're rich, but you're not saying how rich he is, right? However, when you praise him for silver, that's a qualitative problem. That's the thing, like you're praising him for one thing and what he has is another thing. And that's the idea here with God. So For this example would have indicated that the perfections of him may be exalted, while more perfect than the perfections that are ascribed to him still belong to the same species as the latter. As we have demonstrated, this is not so. But the wisdom of the parable is that you're praising the king who has gold and you're praising him with silver. So you're praising God with strength, but what God has isn't strength at all. It's not like you said, God, you're almighty because you can lift 1,000 pounds, but really God can lift 2,000 pounds, right? No, what the problem is, that's not the problem. The problem is that when we call God, when God is not powerful in the human way that's measured by pounds, right? When we talk about God being powerful, that's not, we can't describe God that way because we can't comprehend. We don't comprehend how he interacts with this world. We don't comprehend him at all. So there's nothing belonging to the same species as the attributes that are regarded by us as perfections. When we describe God, there's nothing there. There's nothing that God, in God, right, that we think are great things. I can say, oh, he's a really strong guy, right? But that's completely irrelevant to God, right? So these, all these attributes, if I described them that way, they would truly be deficiencies. This is a point he made over and over again, which therefore he said, would that not be an offense to him? That would be an offense to God. By trying to describe him, saying how powerful you are, you're actually insulting him, right? You're being metiach klape mala, like Rambam said before. I have then already made it known to you that everything in these attributes that you regard as a perfection is actually a deficiency. And then he says, and this is really interesting, he ends with a quote from Kohelet, but I think I had Kohelet here. Yes, I did. From the Ecclesiastes, right? So, and this is really beautiful if you understand this in light of what Rambam just taught us. He said, Solomon, peace be upon him, has rightly directed us with regard to this subject in words that should be sufficient for us. This verse alone, it should be enough to remind us of this idea that I just expressed. And that is the following verse. Al tivahel et picha v'libcha, right? Don't confuse your mouth and your heart, right? Al yot maher, don't hurry lahoti davar, to speak things before God, to speak things to God. Ki Elohim b'shamayim v'ato al haaretz, God is in heaven and you are on earth. Al ken yud v'rechem atin, so don't speak so much, don't talk so much, right? God is heaven upon earth, therefore let thy words be few. So that verse in itself sums up everything that the Rambam was trying to say in this chapter. And you could see here clearly that if it was up to the Rambam, half of what we have in our Siddur that was not written by the Anshe Knesset Agdola themselves, the added poems that we say, Rambam would definitely scratch out. I mean, absolutely. But make the prayers a lot shorter. So I don't know, maybe people would like that. But anyway, that ends this chapter. I think it's a good place to stop. And just really quick to recap, in just the 2 sentences. Remember, he started by describing how, even though we only describing God in negations, there still are different levels of knowledge. Number one, that was the main idea. Number two, right, the idea that that prayer is best, true prayer is silence, and that the more we try to think that we're describing the greatness of God, we're actually making it worse, right? And number three, that his outright straight attack on many of the poems that are written in our prayers that describe God in anthropomorphic ways, which according to Rambam is a terrible thing. So I'm going to close there and open the floor to questions, comments, complaints.
I have a question. I have a question and a comment. And I'd like to read you from Exodus, let's see, Exodus chapter 34, verse 5 and verse 6. And I'll just read it because I know you know, but when I look at it, the point of my question is highlighted. Mm-hmm. And the Lord passed before him, Moses, and proclaimed, this is the Lord, according to Exodus, the Lord, merciful and gracious, long-suffering, abundant in goodness and truth, keeping mercy, as you know, about 1,000 generations. It goes on with 13 attributes. Mm-hmm. Now, this is in the Torah attributed to God. It's not to, and I understand the distinction, I sort of understand the distinction between not describing God, but observing the results of his intersection with us. But his thesis although intellectually challenging, when I see these 13 attributes and try to reconcile it with what I'm hearing, it's difficult for me to treat these verses with the kind of condescension that I'm hearing in what you read from Maimonides.
Yeah, well, first of all, you were here when Maimonides directly addressed those verses themselves, right?
Yeah,
And in fact, Maimonides uses those verses as a proof for his idea, because he says, Panailo, you can't see my face, you can only see my back, which Rambam understands to mean you never really understand or see me, right?
okay.
So Maimonides dealt with those directly, and he actually used that as a support for his idea.
Okay.
And he says, and he explains that the attributes there described are not attributes that what that means, therefore, is that they're not attributes that describe God's essence, right? But those are the attributes through which we experience God's running this world, right? We experience God as merciful and kind and so on. We experience the things that he does for us and gives us. So to us, it's as if he's merciful and kind, but in actuality, describing him that way is using a human word, right? It's hard because all of us want to latch on to a human God and say he's kind and he's compassionate. If I cry to him, he's going to listen, right? But Rambam is pounding into our head that that's not how it works.
Well, I guess I'm questioning the use of the word and definition of language. I mean, language is how we describe anything as we experience it, as it comes through the prism of our own personalities. So it's almost attacking the human use of language, which necessarily is what we experience. So when you experience something that's merciful, you attribute it
to a merciful person or a merciful being.
Yeah, and since God is the source of everything, what is wrong with describing him with words as we experience?
Well, there isn't anything wrong with it as long as you understand what you're doing, right?
It's the best we can do.
Yeah, it's the best. Exactly.
We're limited to our capacity. And I think that's in that same book that you were reading from. Moses said, "Who should I tell him sent me?" And he said, "I am that I am." Right. And I don't know the Hebrew. Obviously, I'm an English speaking man. It's the only language I know. But however you would like to translate that for us, I'm sure it's something close to that, right?
Yeah.
So he went back and he told him, I am. So it's good enough for us to know that he exists. That God exists. It's real. It's not a fiction. It's not a fairy tale. And then once we know that, we can go from there. And I think this is what's so beautiful about Rambam's teaching, is that we don't have to know the limitations of God. We don't have to limit him to a certain description. That we can just accept that he is greater in all ways than we can possibly understand or comprehend. And we're not meant to understand or comprehend it all. And it's okay.
Except what's so bad about poetry, because my son's a poet, which is just expanding on the experiences, if you will, in this case.
It's only bad for those that can't comprehend that that's the best we can do, but it's not good enough. Yeah. So if people who are, when you tell them God sits on a throne and they're done with it, they don't go any deeper, they don't pray about it, they don't study scripture, that's good enough. Someone on a church floor one day told me that God's sitting on the throne in heaven, he's waiting for us to get there. Okay, good enough, I know that's where God's at. And then so they go through life never understanding that in everything that was created by God, there is the essence of God in it, and that his presence is everywhere all the time. So in it being everywhere all the time, it can't be anywhere specifically. And so that's really confusing for a lot of people, and they don't want to be confused. They want a simple, easy thing that they can understand and swallow and digest. And so the poetry is beautiful, but it's also, you can lead someone down the wrong path with it.
Yeah. And like he was just saying, Rambam specifically described that to some people, it's not worth telling them this. Rambam, the Pines translation is the vulgar, in the Hebrew it's fools, but it's pitaim, but either way, it means, and I said this early, the Hebrew translation of Maimonides' work is also a translation, because it's translation from the original Judeo-Arabic, which is what Rambam wrote the book in. So the English and the Hebrew are both translations. And since I don't speak Judeo-Arabic, I can't go back to the original. but anyway, yeah, but that's true. You don't sometimes people can't get that. And a lot of people would argue that the poetry serves a good purpose, right? Because it serves to bring people closer to God. And that would be the argument against the Rambam. And in terms of the prayers we say in the synagogue, clearly when it comes to the fixed ones, the basic ones, like the basic structure of prayer that was written by the men of the Great Assembly, right? So those prayers, if we follow the Rambam's guidance and we say exactly what was said, we don't add, we don't subtract. But you all know, especially on the holidays, we add tons of poems and tons of liturgy that was written over the centuries by all kinds of people. A lot of it is beautiful poetry, and a lot of it there's descriptions of God, you know, and some of it is really nice, and some people get really spiritually, you know, turned on by this stuff. But Rambam would not have liked that, you know. You know, okay. Anyway, any other questions, comments?
So was there a siddur that Maimonides used that was consistent with his views that we refer to?
You know, I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know. I really don't know. I guess there must be some historians that know most of Rambam's career. He was the chief rabbi of Cairo, Egypt. So there must be somebody that knows the history of Cairo.
Well, is it fair to say, since he lived in the 1100s, they didn't have the Maksoret, they didn't have a special, do they have a special prayer book for the high holidays where you let loose with this stuff?
I don't imagine that they had books that everyone had in front of them. I do imagine that they probably had writings which the Shliach Tzibur, the one leading the prayers, must have had to read from.
But a special one on high holidays? Is there any?
I'm not an expert in these things. I honestly don't know. There must have been some extra. Rambam was attacking some extra liturgy, so there must have been people that had written stuff.
But all the piyut and all the poems that you read about, they always attribute it to the middle or later part of the Middle Ages, right? Yeah,
most of the piyutim that are added for the holidays are done in the Middle Ages during the days of the Paitanim and so on. Yeah, that's true. But there's so that's was after the Rambam's days. But the ones attributed to Rabbi Elazar HaKalir, that we don't know when he lived, but it was definitely around by the time of Rambam. So there definitely was stuff there. I mean, he was criticizing something.
Okay.
I honestly, I'm just not an expert in this enough to really say and I don't want to make a mistake. But I'm sure that I know for a fact there definitely was liturgy around then.
Okay.
You know, and it had the problem that when I say liturgy, I mean it was not including the standard stuff that was written by Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. That stuff Rambam gave us a pass, right? He said that's you're supposed to say, right? But other stuff, there definitely existed, you know. Right. Yeah. What? Any other comments?
Yes. Do you know if modern Maimonidean adherents would have a siddur that is tailored to his philosophy or his theology?
I'm not aware of one. Maybe it exists. I haven't seen it. There's a lot of prayer books now that cut out because it all in Europe. It was people like to sit and sing for hours and hours in synagogue, right? Nowadays, people like it make it a little quicker, right? So a lot of that stuff we drop, you know, like every in the high holidays. Who says every single song in the prayer book? I mean, no one does, right? We skip around. We do the ones that are in big letters, right? The ones that are most popular. So so our siddurim are getting closer to what Rambam would like, but not quite. You know.
Is there any indication historically of which prayers existed during the time of the men of the Great Assembly? Well, I mean, yeah.
Well, so we don't have. This is tradition. Our tradition is that the basic standard structure of our prayers were written by the men of the Great Assembly. If you read the book of Ezra, right, and you read the various prayers that come in the book of Ezra, Ezra is considered in our tradition to have been one of the members of the Great Assembly, right? So you see a lot of undercurrents and a lot of themes that clearly make the backbone of the modern Jewish prayer book, right? And a lot of the ideas there. So, and the book of Nehemiah. Because they're describing that same time of Ezra and Nehemiah, those two books, right? But we don't have books that go back that far. And to be honest, I don't know what the oldest prayer book that has it. Probably the Gemara, the Talmud itself is probably the oldest one, place where we see it. Okay. Archaeologically, I don't know the answer to that question. It's a fascinating question, but I don't know. Like what the oldest book where we have the Antignes Nagdol's prayers in. Don't know. Somebody look that up and let us know next time we get together. Any other questions, comments? If there aren't, then I was going to say one more thing. I saw, if anyone has, I subscribe to this streaming platform called Highflix, which shows Israeli TV shows, and most of them are in Hebrew language. Some of them are dubbed into English. Most of them have the English subtitles. But they just put out a 3-part documentary on the Rambam. Most of you by now, having went through these classes of mine, know a lot more about the Rambam than they reveal in those 3 documentaries on the television, right? But it's still, so you're already too educated, right? Because you're going to watch the TV and wonder why they didn't say this, that, or the other thing. but it's still nice to watch. It's well done.
And what's the name of it? How would I get?
I think it's called in English. I think it's called the Great Eagle. In Hebrew, it's the Nesher Hagadol. Because over time, Rambam earned that nickname, the Great Eagle.
And how did you access it? Netflix?
So it's Highflix, CHAI Flix, Highflix.
Okay.
You have to pay for a subscription. It's only a few bucks a month,
Okay.
but there's a lot of good Israeli TV on there. That's how I keep up with my modern Hebrew. I try to watch the shows without.
Once you subscribe, can you access it if you only know English? Can you put in like Great Eagle?
Oh yeah, well, Highflix is actually, it's marketed, I think, outside Israel. So they take all Israeli TV and then they put English, subtitles.
Oh, okay.
And some of the shows they might dub it in English, some of them, but most of them are subtitles.
Okay.
But you can watch Israeli TV if you're interested in watching Israeli TV. It's a great way to do it because there's a lot of good TV from there. But I just watch random comedy shows just because I want to keep up with modern Hebrew, So and you can find that stuff on there. But I saw that this documentary is very interesting, and the scholars that they interview are all top-notch Maimonidean scholars from different sides of the spectrum, and they have some footage that's really cool and so on. So I have criticisms too, but overall, it's a TV show, so it's interesting. It's nice. So anyway, I think that'll, unless someone has something major to say, I'll call it a close for the evening.
Thank you.
All right. Have a wonderful evening, everybody. Thank you for joining. Looking forward to next week.
Okay.
That's all right.
Thank you.
Thank you.